Hello, it's Nancy Miller, and this is a teaser, a short sample of the bonus episode for paid subscribers for February. You can support the show and hear more of this episode, along with many more bonus episodes via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime is 100% listener supported. So thank you so much for listening to the show, and I hope you enjoy this teaser of the February bonus episode. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the February bonus episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. Thank you for subscribing to the podcast. It's Nancy. And for tonight's episode, we're going to continue on with the fascinating career of forensic ecologist Patricia Wiltshire and a very high-profile case that catapulted Pat Wiltshire and her highly specialized field of forensic ecology into the spotlight. This case was featured in Professor Wiltshire's book, published in 2020, called The Nature of Life and Death: Everybody Leaves a Trace. But as always, this is my Dead Sleep version. It's slow crime with lots of detours and details to help unwind your mind and fall asleep. Also, I've done something that I don't think other true crime podcasts have done before. I've written this in 2 chapters at nearly exactly 30 minutes each. Which means if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or another podcast app, you can set your sleep timer for 30 minutes and just hear part 1. And then you can come back later and listen to the second half and just scrub ahead to that 30-minute mark and hear part 2. You can also just listen to the whole thing. But I thought it might be helpful for those nights where you just want something to send you off, but not commit to the whole thing. And maybe you're a little OCD and you like things to be nice and neat and even. Go on ahead and set that sleep timer for the 30-minute mark. And then join us later for the second half. I hope that helps. As a true crime insomniac, it's something I always wanted, and now I get a chance to explore it and write it that way because of your generous support. So thank you so much for supporting the show. So with that, let's just get started and get comfortable wherever you are as we once again return to England and an incident that took place exactly 20 years ago, Valentine's Day, 2005, in a port city known as Hull, England, located in the northeast of England in East Yorkshire along the North Sea. Spend any time in Hull or in the area of Yorkshire or in just about any part of England, you'll start to feel like you're being watched. And that's because you are. There are cameras, closed-circuit TVs, CCTV, all over Great Britain. England, in particular, is one of the most surveilled countries in the world. And the use of video, in one form or another, has been a part of British society and national security for decades. Even as far back as 2004, there were 4 million security cameras publicly available and accessible to police. A person could be captured anywhere from 30 to 300 times in a single day. For the average person going about an average day, it was just a simple fact of life. But for a man hoping to get away with murder, those cameras made things far more complicated. Just how far would someone need to go to elude the all-seeing eyes of England's 4 million cameras? Late one night, in February of 2005, there was one killer, desperate to find out. Snaking his way along the lonely motorways, crawling around the corners of the country roads. He would drive as far as he could, to the ends of the earth if he had to, until he found that perfect spot. A no man's land he'd make one woman's final resting place. Monday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2005. There were all kinds of things a young couple in love could do on Valentine's Day. Champagne, candy, a romantic dinner. But a 30-year-old man named Paul wanted one thing: for his fiancée Joanne to come home safe. It was 9 o'clock at night, and Paul had gone through all of the phases, from annoyed to anxious to worried to terrified. Where was Joanne? Frantic, he called Joanne's parents and explained that she hadn't come home from work and that her car was there. Joanne was not. Had they seen her? When they said no, he knew he couldn't wait any longer, and so Paul had to make that dreaded decision. He was going to call 999 and phone the police. What was her physical description? Joanne Nelson was 22 years old, white female with blue eyes, slim build, long blonde hair with fringe-like bangs in the front. Paul said he last saw her this morning, and everything seemed fine, better than fine. They'd exchanged Valentine's Day cards before he left for work. Paul said he left her a big surprise. When she woke up and got out of bed, Joanne would find a gift bag waiting for her. Inside the gift bag was, at long last, a proper engagement ring. The fancy one she'd said she'd wanted, which for Paul, on his machinist salary, was a real splurge. But of course, Joanne was worth it. They planned to get married the following year, 2006. And he couldn't wait to make Joanne his wife. He couldn't wait for her to be Mrs. Paul Dyson. There might have been a time when local authorities would have said, "Give it another 24 hours. Joanne was young. 22 years old? Maybe she went out with her girlfriends. Maybe she met someone else. Maybe she had a whole other secret life, one that Paul knew nothing about. But this was East Yorkshire, not West Yorkshire. And in 2005, everyone could still remember what happened in West Yorkshire, when the police, the public, everyone, made assumptions about young women and the lives they led, and the attention their cases deserved, or didn't deserve. In 1975, this was some 30 years before Joanne went missing. A serial killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper claimed his first victim, a young woman in her late 20s named Wilma Mary McCann. In the papers, she was depicted as a good-time girl, a euphemistic shorthand for a sex worker. And when she was ultimately found, authorities chalked up her death, which struck them as impulsive, unplanned, and violent, as a one-off, a casualty of her own lifestyle, snuffed out by some punter, a random client she'd invited into her sphere by offering her services. The police, the public had little sympathy at that time. Her death was what was known back then as a fish and chips murder. Her murder would appear once in one newspaper. Then that paper would be used to wrap fish and chips the next day. She'd be gone and forgotten. Her life and dignity diluted with malt vinegar and smeared in old fry grease. The Yorkshire Ripper roamed free for 5 years taking the lives of 13 women and went after 7 more, until he was finally apprehended by chance in 1981 while in a car with a woman who might have been his next victim. And there's a refreshing, detailed account of the Yorkshire Ripper case told from the families of those victims and survivors in a book called Somebody's Mother, Somebody's Daughter by author Carol Ann Lee. Joanne Nelson was born in 1983, 2 years after the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper was apprehended. If you've listened to past episodes, you know I don't like to say the real names of the serial killers, and I prefer to make up silly nicknames to take the fear out of these men, to inhibit their notoriety and reduce their footprint in true crime culture. You can find the Yorkshire Ripper's real name anywhere, but for this episode, I'd like to rename him something North England sounding, like Yorkshire Pudding Poop Face or Stanky Bog Breath. Anyway, Yorkshire Pudding Poop Face Stanky Bog Breath was apprehended in 1981. He'd die in prison in 2020. In that aftermath of how police might have bungled the investigation through their bias and blame of the victims, it had a lasting impact and made people, women, distrustful of authorities looking out for them, which might have been one reason why Paul took charge so quickly and told authorities back at his house that he and Joanne's family were going to start knocking door to door, ASAP, and not wait another second, especially when it was discovered that Joanne hadn't shown up for work that day. Everyone feared if someone had kidnapped her, or worse, the suspect now had a 12-hour lead on police. Local authorities didn't dally on this case. They dispatched a task force of over 100 officers who also went door to door along with those volunteers, asking if they'd seen 22-year-old Joanne. The city of Hull is relatively small, a population of a couple 100,000. In recent years, Hull has enjoyed a renaissance as a destination for film and TV production, even earning Hull the nickname Hollywood. But 20 years ago, it was still in the throes of economic decline, struggling to recover from its long-gone fishing industry. Maybe there'd been a robbery, and it all went wrong. Joanne worked at a local employment office in Hull. She helped people find jobs, and she likely met all kinds of people from all walks of life, which unfortunately, for any investigation, would mean an Olympic-sized suspect pool. Joanne was known for having a huge heart and a trusting nature. Maybe someone preyed on Joanne's trusting nature. If Paul's timeline was correct, something had to have happened before Joanne left for work, which explained why she'd left her car behind. Paul was at work. He had an alibi for that morning. But everyone knew how police investigations worked. They always assumed it was the partner first. Apparently sensing this, Paul, from the very first night, went on the defense, assuring Joanne's parents he had nothing to do with this. He idolized Joanne. They had to focus on getting Joanne back, wherever she was. February 14th came and went. No Joanne. February 15th, then the 16th. Dread about what happened to Joanne increasing with every second, minute, hour she was gone. It was common knowledge even back then that the key to finding a missing person was by raising public awareness. Facebook, Twitter, they were in their nascent stages. There was no viable social media back then. This case needed more publicity, and door knocking wasn't going to cut it. So when a news show invited Paul to do an interview, of course he was going to say yes. He invited camera crews into his home, their home, and clutched a picture of his young bride-to-be as he broke down. Paul was used to playing the strong man, a guy's guy who once worked as a doorman at a local nightclub. That's actually how he and Joanne met, back when Joanne was just 19 and Paul was around 27. But on TV, he was a shell of that macho man now. In one interview, the camera zoomed in on Paul's anguished face, and tears rolling down his pale pink cheeks as he dabbed at them with a tattered wad of tissue. Paul declared his love for Joanne, begging for her return, in a voice that sounded like a far more emotional version of this Northern England AI-accented rendering you're about to hear. He said he loved her to bits.
I love her to bits.
He said he just wanted her back.
I just want her back.
She didn't have a bad bone in her body.
She hasn't got a bad bone in her body.
He just wants to know where she is.
I just want to know where she is. I just want to know where she is. I just want to know where she is.
Local investigators, including a high-ranking detective named Ray Higgins, watched Paul on TV. They studied his every move.
I just want to know where she is.
Paused at every frame, looking for the tiniest gesture of reveal. Was Paul telling the truth? Anyone watching at home might have been moved by Paul's tears, but Detective Higgins and his colleagues weren't so impressed. Someone noticed how Paul squeezed his eyes shut, working himself up to get those tears going. His face was all pink, his eyes scrunched so tight. He pushed his body so hard. He didn't look like a grown man, more like a colicky baby. But behavior like that, or one's impression of someone's crocodile tears, it was just that. Perception. Nothing police could act on. They needed something real, something they could point to. Back on TV, Paul, still snuffling, gave a forlorn glance down towards the ragged shred of tissue he now pressed between his two thumbs. The camera followed Paul's gaze, then slowly did a close-up of the tissue, of the thumbs, a shot meant to capture a man's pain. But it caught something else. Wait a second. For Detective Higgins, it was a crucial clue. Higgins noticed something on Paul's thumbs. There were marks, the shape of half moons, crescent-shape indentations just below the knuckles. Those marks. They weren't scratches. They were too clean, too even, that crescent shape in his skin. Detective Higgins was a veteran cop. He'd seen those indentations before. Those marks, the half moons embedded just below the knuckles, were a special shape. It was the shape that someone's fingernails made when they were struggling to remove another person's hands from being wrapped around their throat. A flash went through Detective Higgins' mind of what that scene could have looked like. Maybe it started with an argument. It most definitely ended with Joanne fighting for her life. Joanne wasn't kidnapped. She wasn't out there somewhere, not alive. She'd been murdered by her own boyfriend, a big, clumsy, ugly man who up and decided to kill his fiancée with his big, clumsy, ugly hands. These were just suspicions, however, and those marks on Paul's thumbs, they were superficial. They needed to bring Paul in for questioning before those half moons healed. And the faintest proof at what he'd done disappeared.